She would later say that the moment she realized her life was gone wasn't when the bank card failed, and it wasn't when her son admitted what he'd done. It was when she opened her purse at a dusty bus stop and counted exactly $11. Because in that moment, Margaret Lewis understood that at 72 years old, she no longer had a home, a family she could trust, or a plan for tomorrow. Only a wrinkled tan and a single coin that suddenly felt heavier than the 40 years she had spent, saving every spare rupee, dollar, and coin she could tuck away for safety. The kind of safety old people whisper about when they don't want to be a burden. The kind of safety she thought she had built carefully through decades of packing school lunches, mending clothes instead of buying new ones, skipping vacations, flipping coupons, and saying no to herself so she could always say yes to her children, especially to Eric, her youngest, the one who had always been good with computers, the one who insisted on setting up her online banking because, Mom, you shouldn't stress about this stuff, the one who told her to trust him because he was her son, and she had, without question, without suspicion, without even checking the statements he told her not to worry about, until the morning her card declined at the grocery store while a line of strangers waited behind her, and the cashier politely tried again as if the machine had made a mistake, and Margaret smiled an embarrassed little smile, certain this would be fixed in seconds, only to hear the same soft beep of refusal that echoed louder than it should have, louder than the whispers behind her, louder than her own heartbeat as she stepped aside and called the bank with shaking fingers, expecting a technical error, a frozen card, something simple, something harmless, and instead listened to a calm voice inform her that her savings account balance was not missing a few dollars, not delayed, not glitched, but emptied, drained carefully over months in small transfers she had never noticed because someone else had been watching for her, someone she loved, someone who had watched her trust him completely while moving her entire life into his own account piece by piece, like removing bricks from a house until it collapses without warning. And when she called Eric, already knowing the truth before he spoke, hoping against hope for some explanation that would make this less cruel, he did not deny it, did not apologize, did not sound ashamed, but instead said words that would echo inside her for weeks afterward. I needed it more than you, Ma. You don't even go anywhere. What were you saving it for? And in that moment, she realized something worse than theft had occurred, because money could be rebuilt in theory, but the way he had spoken to her, the way he had reduced her entire existence to something unnecessary, something idle, something that did not deserve security, cut deeper than any financial loss ever could. And she did not scream, did not threaten police, did not argue, because the fight drained out of her all at once, replaced by a hollow quiet that settled into her chest like cold air. And by evening she had packed a single suitcase without fully remembering doing it, left the house that now felt like a stranger's place, and walked to the bus stop with the strange numbness of someone watching their own life from far away, not even sure where she was going, only knowing she could not stay where trust had turned into humiliation. And after paying for a bus ticket to the next town and buying a small sandwich she couldn't finish, she sat on a cracked wooden bench, staring at a community board layered with sun-bleached flyers and torn advertisements, her mind empty, her future blank, until her eyes landed on a half-ripped piece of paper flapping in the wind that read, in faded ink, "Old hunting cabin for sale. Cash only. Must be cleared today. $10. And she almost laughed at the absurdity of it, because what kind of life decision can be made with $10 and no plan? But something inside her, something that had been quiet for years under responsibility and routine, stirred gently and told her that maybe, just maybe, a place nobody wanted was exactly where she belonged right now, because it could not judge her, could not betray her, could not take anything else from her. And so she tore off the phone number with fingers that trembled not from fear, but from a strange, fragile thread of hope, the first she had felt since the grocery store, and called the number before she could think too hard about how foolish this all was, how 72 was too old to start over, how people her age were supposed to be settled, safe, surrounded by family instead of sitting alone with $11 in a suitcase. And when the man on the other end answered and sounded surprised that anyone had even called about the cabin, Margaret heard herself say, "I'll take it," before doubt could speak up, before reality could argue, because for the first time in her life, she wasn't choosing something practical or sensible or approved by someone else. She was choosing something simply because it was available and hers to choose. And as she hung up the phone and looked down at the single $10 bill and the lone coin in her palm, she didn't feel poor. She felt strangely light, as if everything heavy had already been taken from her, and what remained was just enough to begin again somewhere small, somewhere quiet, somewhere that did not know her as a mother, a victim, or an old woman who had been foolish enough to trust, but simply as Margaret, a woman with a suitcase, $11, and nothing left to lose. The cabin was worse than the man on the phone had described, and somehow that made Margaret feel more certain she had made the right choice. Because as she stepped out of his old pickup truck and looked at the leaning structure swallowed by tall grass and crooked trees, she didn't see something broken. She saw something forgotten, and for the first time since her son's voice had reduced her life to "what were you saving it for?" she felt like she had arrived somewhere that expected nothing from her at all. No explanations, no dignity, no history, just her quiet presence and the $10 bill she handed over without hesitation while the man shook his head, as if she were buying a pile of rotting wood instead of a place to breathe. And when he drove away, leaving her alone in a silence so deep she could hear the wind moving through branches like distant waves, Margaret stood still for a long moment with her suitcase in hand, listening to the kind of quiet that doesn't exist in houses, filled with memories, arguments, televisions, and expectations. And she realized that this was the first space she had entered in decades that held no trace of her past, no reminders of who she had been for everyone else. And as she pushed open the warped cabin door, the smell of dust and old timber rushed out to meet her like an exhale from another time, thick and stale but oddly comforting, because it felt honest, nothing polished, nothing pretending, just age and abandonment and the simple truth of a place that had been left alone for years. And she stepped inside carefully, her shoes crunching on dried leaves that had blown in through a broken window, her eyes adjusting to dim light filtering through crooked boards. And she set her suitcase down on a rickety table, as if claiming the space without saying a word, noticing the sagging cot in the corner, the small rusted stove, the shelves lined with jars long emptied of their contents. And she did not feel fear or regret, or even sadness. Only a strange loosening in her chest, like a tight knot slowly unraveling. Because here there was no one to disappoint, no one to disappoint her. And that night she sat on the porch steps watching the sky turn orange and then dark behind the trees, listening to insects hum and leaves rustle. And for the first time since the bank call she cried, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly and steadily, tears falling for all the years she had spent being careful and responsible and trusting, tears for the version of herself who thought safety came from money in a bank instead of peace in the heart. And when she finally lay down on the old cot wrapped in her coat for warmth, she slept deeper than she had in months, as if the cabin itself were standing guard over her. And the next morning, she woke with an unfamiliar clarity, not about what she had lost, but about what she could do. And she began sweeping the floor with a broom she found leaning in the corner, pushing piles of leaves and dust toward the door with slow, deliberate strokes, cleaning not because she had to, but because she wanted to make this forgotten place livable. And as she swept near a loose section of floorboards, the broom caught on something solid beneath, making a dull metallic sound that didn't belong there. And she paused, kneeling slowly with curiosity outweighing her tiredness, prying up the warped plank with careful fingers until she revealed a small metal box tucked beneath the floor, rusted around the edges and heavy with the weight of years. And her heart began to beat a little faster, not with excitement exactly, but with the cautious wonder of someone who has stumbled upon something that feels intentional, as if it had been waiting. And she dragged the box into the light, brushing away cobwebs and dirt before noticing the tiny old lock holding it shut. And she looked around the cabin for a moment before finding a dull kitchen knife in a drawer, using it to pry the lock open with surprising patience until it finally snapped with a soft pop. And when she lifted the lid, she did not find tools or junk or trash as she half expected, but a stack of carefully wrapped envelopes protected in oilcloth, dry and preserved, as if someone had wanted them to survive time itself. And on top of them lay a faded black and white photograph of a young man in a military uniform standing proudly in front of this very cabin. The same porch, the same crooked door, only straighter, newer, alive with purpose. and Margaret sat down slowly on the floor, the box beside her, as a strange feeling settled over her. Not excitement, not confusion, but the quiet sense that she was not alone here after all, that this place had a story that had not yet finished being told. And as she gently unwrapped the envelopes, noticing the careful handwriting, the dates from decades ago, and a single unopened bank envelope resting beneath them all, she felt something shift inside her again, a small spark of curiosity that had been buried under betrayal and exhaustion. And for the first time since she counted those $11 at the bus stop, Margaret felt something other than loss guiding her forward, something subtle but undeniable, as if this cabin, forgotten by everyone else, had been waiting patiently for someone like her to arrive and listen. Margaret did not rush to open the old bank envelope, not because she wasn't curious, but because something about the moment felt delicate, like a thread that could snap if pulled too quickly. So she sat at the small table by the crooked window with the metal box beside her and the photograph of the young soldier resting in her lap, studying his face as if he might explain why his memories had been hidden beneath the floorboards of a collapsing cabin for nearly 50 years. And when she finally slid her finger beneath the brittle flap and unfolded the yellowed letter inside, she realized almost immediately that she was holding something that had been forgotten by the world but not by time, because the paper carried the official stamp of a bank long closed, acknowledging a safety deposit box registered to Thomas Hale, the man in the photograph, never reclaimed after his death. And Margaret read the lines twice, then 3 times, her eyes tracing the box number and the branch location, printed clearly at the top. And a strange realization dawned on her slowly, like morning light creeping through trees, because the branch listed in the letter was not in some distant city or another state, but in the very town she had arrived in by accident, the town she had chosen only because a bus happened to be leaving when she felt too numb to think. And she felt a quiet chill move through her arms as she looked around the cabin, suddenly aware that this place, this forgotten $10 purchase, was connected to something far larger than she had understood. And 2 days later she found herself sitting across from a bank manager who looked as puzzled as she felt, while she carefully explained how she had come into possession of the documents, laying the photograph, the letter, and the cabin purchase receipt on the desk like pieces of a story neither of them fully grasped yet. And after several phone calls, archived records, and a long wait filled with polite confusion, the manager returned with a small metal box carried with both hands, setting it down gently in front of her, as if it were fragile. And Margaret's breath caught not from excitement, but from the weight of the moment, because she had walked into that office with no expectations, only curiosity, and now something real sat between them, something that had waited decades to be opened. And when the key turned and the lid lifted, she did not see money first. She saw a collection of war medals neatly arranged, a worn leather journal, and beneath them a bundle of papers tied with faded string that the manager carefully unfolded to reveal bearer bonds long matured, their value quietly multiplying over time while the world forgot they existed. And the numbers he spoke next did not register immediately, because Margaret was staring at the medals, imagining the young man in the photograph, imagining him returning to this cabin after the war, placing his most important belongings into a box for safekeeping, perhaps intending to return for them one day and never getting the chance. And when the manager gently repeated the total, over $90,000, Margaret covered her mouth with both hands and began to cry, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the deep, trembling relief of someone who had been carrying invisible weight for too long, because it wasn't the money that broke her composure. It was the overwhelming feeling that somehow, impossibly, she had been guided here, to this place nobody wanted, to this cabin she bought with her last $10, to this story that had waited quietly for her to find it. And she felt something she had not felt since before the grocery store, before the phone call, before her son's voice had made her feel small and unnecessary. She felt looked after, as if a stranger from 50 years ago had reached through time to place a hand gently on her shoulder and say, "You're not alone." And months later the cabin no longer leaned quite so much, because Margaret had hired a local carpenter to fix the porch, replace the window, and straighten the door. Flowers grew in small pots outside, smoke curled from the chimney in the evenings, and people in town began to recognize her as the quiet older woman who always smiled kindly at the market, never telling them the full story of how she arrived with $11 in a suitcase, because the details felt too sacred to explain. And when her phone rang one afternoon with her son's name glowing on the screen, she let it ring without guilt, without anger, without even curiosity. Because she had learned something more important than forgiveness or revenge. She had learned that peace did not come from getting back what was taken, but from finding something that could never be taken again. And on the small table beside her bed, she kept 3 things arranged carefully. The single $1 coin she had left after buying the cabin, the rusted metal box that had been hidden beneath the floor, and the cabin key, not as reminders of betrayal, but as proof that the lowest moment of her life had quietly led her to the place where she finally understood that sometimes losing everything is the only way life can guide you exactly where you were meant to be.